All right, we'll continue on with chapter 4, the discussion of metabolism of cells and their relationships with energy. Today we're going to be mostly focused on anaerobic metabolism. This is how cells get energy without oxygen. It turns out this is the kind of the key thing is the presence or absence of oxygen that determines uh, what cells can be present and what types of metabolism are present. And uh, this is a big distinction. All eukaryotes can do aerobic metabolism, but not all prokaryotes. And so it seems like the first metabolism was anaerobic. These these just show different rocks layers, sedimentary rocks deposited under different conditions. The iron in the bottom layer here, these are the banded irons layers, and they are deposited some with oxygen and some without. Here it's all without oxygen. Remember last time I introduced the idea that cells use ATP as their central energy molecule. Here's a picture of ATP. It's adenine, what's one of the bases in nucleic acids, ribose, and then ATP has three phosphates on, and these bonds between the phosphate units are high energy bonds, which cells can use to store and release energy. And this is the compound that all cells use to do this, and so it's a central energy molecule in all living organisms. And how cells get energy is related to metabolism, and metabolism are the series of chemical reactions that occur in cells. Um, and metabolism is really related to the enzymes. The enzymes lower the energy needed to force a chemical to react. And so metabolism is just how enzymes change a substrate, and that substrate can be changed several times by several different enzymes to produce an end product. Okay, and enzymes can be shut off. So here this just shows an inhibition pathway to do that. But so all chemical reactions within cells occur because of the presence of different enzymes. And these enzymes are arranged in pathways. In systems, there's a kind of nice symmetry in that the producers take carbon dioxide and water and they use sunlight to make glucose and oxygen, and they produce ATP in doing so. Heterotrophs like us are consumers, and they use glucose and oxygen again to produce more ATP. And so the ultimate source of energy comes from the sun, and these chemicals are recycled between producers and consumers. Okay, so we talked about this relationship, of what goes on in these reactions here, and this is showing a mitochondria. And in eukaryotes, this is a really important organelle because the oxygen using parts of the aerobic metabolism occur in the mitochondria. So aerobic metabolism breaks down sugar in four steps: glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, then the Krebs or citric acid cycle, and then finally electron transport. And this allows them to get energy out of glucose molecules. All this requires is the presence of oxygen and sugar. Okay, so now we're going to go into this first step and what happens in this first step if oxygen isn't present. This first step is glycolysis. And this occurs in all cells, and it really doesn't use oxygen. And what happens is a 6-carbon sugar like glucose is split into two 3-carbon molecules, and these are pyruvates. And this yields some energy for each glucose molecule that's in there. And if oxygen is present, these pyruvates will be transported into the mitochondria where the oxygen will be used to take off hydrogens and carbons and release ATP. But if no oxygen is present, this leads to an anaerobic fermentation. And in humans, this can happen to us in a couple places. Okay, anaerobic respiration in humans is glycolysis and then the conversion of pyruvate to lactate or lactic acid. And that we can do this in our muscles and in certain organs like our liver. And this allows them to rapidly produce ATP when oxygen isn't available. This each each glucose that enters this reaction will produce 2 ATP, and that will produce 2 pyruvates. The only bad thing about this is that pyruvates have to be converted to something else, and that's lactic acid. And this really takes just a single enzyme. But this stuff accumulates. It's hard to transport and hard to get rid of because it's a big molecule. It has 3 carbons. It's not like carbon dioxide or water. And it changes the pH. And so this has to be transported to the liver, where the liver uses oxygen to get rid of this. And so, but this is actually useful when can't produce oxygen fast enough in the muscle. We can still get some energy. And this is really important in people. We often refer to anaerobic activities as like strength training, or sprinting. So if you ever watch a guy like Usain Bolt, one of the world-class sprinters, they really don't breathe during their races. And they are not breathing hard at the end of the race, but they can only run about 200 meters. So it's a very short duration where they can rely on this anaerobic metabolism. And of course, this can only use carbohydrates. And in effect, it'll produce lots of lactic acid. Okay, for the same amount of lactic acid as the amount of carbohydrates consumed. And this is what causes muscle fatigue. And so to do this, we have to store lots of carbohydrates in the muscle. We build up big, strong muscles. And this kind of training also helps to produce bone mass. Aerobic training, like this sprinter here is doing, is lower intensity, but the long duration means it can continue as long as we can supply oxygen to the muscles. And this can use not only carbohydrates, but fat. Okay, and so this can consume lots of energy and can lead to weight loss. And here the limiting factor is not the accumulation of lactic acid because only carbon dioxide and water is produced. Here what's limiting is oxygen delivery. And so this improves heart efficiency and blood vessel health and respiratory health. And so aerobic training is really good for our cardiovascular system and our lungs. Strength training really doesn't do anything for the heart or lungs, but it will improve muscle mass and bone mass. So these are really important distinctions to be aware of. I'm sure some of the athletes in class have heard of these things. Aerobic training generally has to last 15 to 20 minutes to produce an elevated heart rate that will get this kind of training effect. Okay, and so we do this, but we don't do it often and only under certain conditions. And most of our activities are aerobic. And some of our organs can only use aerobic activities, like our heart muscle and our brain. Okay, there is lots of other organisms, though, that have to be able to do anaerobic metabolism, that they may be without oxygen at some times or some places. Turns out all animals can do glycolysis, and all animals do that lactic acid production. Okay, so they have a limited strength or a limited ability to use these powerful muscles. But when there's maximum effort needed and maximum strength needed, all animals will do this anaerobic production. In yeast are fungi. They do glycolysis too, but instead of producing lactic acid, they have a different series of enzymes, and they convert pyruvate to ethanol and carbon dioxide. Okay, and so we use yeast to make bread and alcoholic beverages, and carbon dioxide is produced and vented off these giant chambers, and then ethanol can be produced. When we bake bread, that ethanol comes off in the heating of the bread, and so it's lost that way, and the carbon dioxide is what makes the bread rise. There's many bacteria. Virtually all of them can do glycolysis, and depending on what enzymes they have, their fermentation products can be different. They can produce all sorts of alcohols, they can produce acids, they can produce methane, They can produce sulfuric compounds, nitrogen compounds, and so they really produce a wide variety of compounds. And these can be used for industry in fermentation chambers, but we also see them um, in different times in different places in the environment. Here, this is an algal bloom off the coast. I think it's uh, of California, but I could be wrong there. And so you see this algal bloom of color here, and this is produced by sulfate reducing bacteria that are producing hydrogen sulfide. That's that rotten egg smell that you sometimes get from lakes or other kind of wastewater ponds where there's low oxygen but lots of nutrients available. It turns out all bacteria can do this, and glycolysis is very, very old, and fermentations are very, very old. And not only can all cells do it, they do it in similar ways, the same number of steps. They all do it in the cytoplasm. We believe the first cells were able to do this. And so there's lots and lots of different types of anaerobes. The oldest fossils that we find were deposited under anaerobic conditions. They were before oxygen was common in the atmosphere. And so those organisms must have been using anaerobic metabolism. Um, since all eukaryotes use oxygen but don't appear late in the fossil record, this is also consistent. So the question kind of is, where did oxygen come from? And it turns out it's got to be photosynthesis. And we think single-celled prokaryotes called the cyanobacteria were the first organisms to use this aerobic metabolism to produce oxygen. It was just a waste product for them. And we see fossils, stromatolites, which sometimes under certain conditions still form today. And these first appear in the fossil record about 75% back in the age of the Earth. So they're very, very old, 2.7 billion years. By contrast, eukaryotes are only about probably 500 to 700 million years ago, so 0.7 billion years. Okay, we'll summarize this again later in the week, and then we'll start talking about photosynthesis.